Hi and welcome to Photo IQ. I'm your instructor Gus Cantivero and this is the landscape module, and in this unit we're going to be talking about low light photography and astrophotography. Let's get started. Low light photography is definitely a challenge for some. Once you get used to the concept, it's not actually that different from shooting photography in available light during the day. But it's not exactly something that is a normal situation that you'd encounter, so there's definitely some things that you're going to have to consider before you get started. So yes, it is definitely true, low light photography or night photography or astrophotography, which is shooting stars, is going to require more planning. There's a couple of obvious things that you may not actually have thought about. So thinking about taking a landscape or a cityscape or an outdoor scene during the daytime, well, it's obvious because you can see everything that's in the shot. At nighttime, you may not actually see everything that's there. If there's artificial lights in the scene, those are going to be illuminating certain areas, and then your eye is not going to pick up the areas that are in the dark pools of shadow. So if you're going to be shooting a scene that has no artificial light and it's illuminated only by the moon or the stars, then there's a lot there that you can't actually see. Take this image for example. I shot this in Moab in Arches National Park, and it was around 12:30 at night. There was no visible moon. The moon was actually low around the horizon at that time, so there wasn't any light directly illuminating the canyon wall. It's a 30-second exposure. I shot it with my Fuji X100F, a camera that I don't have anymore. It's a 23mm lens, which is around a 35mm equivalent for full frame. And the aperture was f2.5. So a 30-second exposure allows the sensor a lot of time to take in that light and build up the exposure to the point where we can actually see an image. If you shot it at 1 second or a 30th of a second, you would get nothing. It would just be a purely black frame. So once I exposed the shot, I was actually really surprised to see how much of that canyon wall was actually in view. To my naked eye, I could barely see it. Even after being out there for 10 or 15 minutes with my eyes adjusting, I could barely make out what was there because it was kind of in the distance. The size of these canyons are massive. They're really, really big. So when they're kind of far away, your eye can't pick them up. So one interesting way to actually see in the dark is to take a night photo and you can see what's out there. Now, if you visit that spot during the day, you can sort of plan out your composition and what you want it to look like, the rough position. You can even leave a rock or, something, a stick jammed in the ground to say this is where I want to be so that I can get this or this angle. If you don't go and pre-scout or pre-plan it during the day, then you're kind of going to be open for surprises once you take that photo. Surprises are not a bad thing. In fact, that could be a really great reward for taking a chance. And in fact, I didn't do any pre-planning for this photo. I just shot it and it ended up coming out really cool. I was very pleased with it. You can see all the stars up in the sky. There's a really cool light fade where it goes from the total blackness up here down to the lightness in the horizon. And that can be due from location of the moon or the phase of the transition from day into night. There's a lot of reasons why you can get that. There could even be a city in the distance over there illuminating the sky and creating a transition. It does require a lot of patience because you're going to have to wait a while between 20 and 30 seconds for your image to expose, see what you like or don't like about it, recompose, making slight changes this way or that way in order to nail that composition. Your focus is also going to be very difficult because you're going to have to manually focus. The autofocus obviously won't pick anything up, it'll be too dark. So you're going to have to take the shot, examine the photo by playing it back on your screen, and then recomposing, refocusing, making adjustments to your exposure until you nail it and get it the way that you want it to be. Another thing that again may be obvious to some, but to others may not even think about, you're going to need some kind of support because your camera is going to be, your shutter is going to be open for between 15 to 30 seconds That's a long time, and any vibration or shake to the camera is going to cause a shaken image with a lot of smearing, and it'll look like it's out of focus when in fact it's actually just camera movement that you're seeing. Now, it could be a tripod, it could be a small little tabletop tripod like my Joby, which is a great little travel solution. And then you can place this on a wall, on a rock, on the ground to get different viewpoints. Another thing that I like to use, which in a pinch, is my wallet. I'll just set this down and then I'll use that to angle the lens up. And of course, there's, depending on if you have other rocks or something else, you can, figure it out. But the reason why I'll use a wallet or something like that is because it's soft, it's padded, leather, so it's going to stick to the surface that it's on if it's on a rock. Unless it's really dusty, then it may slide down. So you can just come up with any kind of solution that you need in order to hold your camera in position. Avoiding shake isn't just in having a camera on a tripod or support. That's also going to be when you press the shutter button, there is a little bit of a vibration that's going through the camera. Also, some cheaper or lower quality tripods or tripods that are not really solidly planted in the ground may have some vibration or micro vibrations. So when the shutter is open, try to avoid walking around or touching the camera or the tripod, because those vibrations will go up those legs and cause the camera to shake. You'll end up with an image that you think is out of focus when in fact it's actually just shaking during the exposure. The last tip that I'll give to avoid shake is to actually use the timer mode. Now, normally you think the timer mode is for taking a group shot where you want to get into it. So you'll set it on a 10-second delay, and then that'll give you a chance to run into the picture. It'll snap it, and then you get your photo. Another way to use the self timer is to actually hit the shutter, and then it gives the camera a chance to settle down and for those vibrations to go away before the shutter opens. So a 3-second shutter is usually plenty. Now, I'm actually going to show you my first ever low light photograph. I shot this when I was about 16 years old, when I was a young photo assistant for a wedding photographer. And I was on a break, I was outside, and I had a camera loaded with black and white film. And I was intrigued by the night scene with the shadows. It's a patio, there's a large light over here, there's trees that are backlit by some environmental lighting, and there's some iron chairs that are here, steel chairs, where they have these interesting shadow patterns on the patio. Now, looking back on this photo, it's not a particularly great photograph, but I can definitely see my young self in the photo, what I was looking at, what I was experimenting with, what I was interested in. And it's very interesting for me to go back and look at my really old photos from when I was first learning photography, because I get to see my growth. I actually missed the most interesting part of this scene, which is the shadow patterns on the patio over here. So growth in our art is something that's really beneficial when we look back at those things and we see, oh, I would have taken that photo today versus this overall scene. But at that time, it's my very first low light photo that I can recall and find in my archives. So I was just interested in seeing what would happen. Now remember, I was shooting on film, so I didn't have the benefit of being able to see the exposure on the back of the camera and recomposing and then going in and experimenting further with the scene. It was kind of just taking a photograph and wondering, is this even gonna come out? Is this gonna look like anything? I have no idea. A couple of years later, when I was in college studying photography, this is before I started taking color photography, but I was still interested in color. And one of the interesting things that I thought about here was that I think I was always a color photographer. I was always interested in the use of color, even in night scenes. How the street lights in this scene are so otherworldly and yellow. How the color temperature is so extreme, and how the color is really the only thing that you see in the photo, where these pools of night blackness are just perfectly black and there's nothing to even identify within the shadow area. The photograph on the smaller inset here, this is just further down that street when I turn around and go in the other direction, and seeing this long view of how there's these pools of yellow in the scene, and then there's perfect blackness intersected between. There's no overlap in the lighting. So it's kind of an interesting depth play that's going on here. Now, I don't have digital files for these or the negatives that I could find, or a scanner to scan the negatives even if I wanted to. So all I can do is take a photograph of a print. So these are not going to be perfect representations, but you can get an idea of what's going on. And again, these were shot on film with a tripod, but I had no idea what they were going to look like until after I developed and printed the images. One other genre of low-light photography would be a cityscape. Now, a cityscape is still a landscape. Just because it's of a city doesn't mean it isn't a landscape. It's a broad scene with a lot of scenery, context of the location, and it has an artistic representation of the environment. So it's still a landscape, and if that's something you're interested in, you should feel free to go ahead and try that out. Maybe you live in a high-rise where you can actually get a really interesting view of the city during the day or at night, and that could be a great location to shoot from. Maybe you have a friend or someone, a family member who has access to a rooftop. Now, these are great places to experiment and shoot. Try to get there maybe around sunset and hang out and talk and chat, and then when it gets darker, you can take some transitional photos, and then ultimately when it's perfectly night, you can get a really good dark night shot. Cityscapes will present a number of their own challenges, which you're going to have to become experienced with and experiment with. Now, of course, there's going to be changing environments because there could be construction cranes or things like that that will obstruct your view. Mixed color temperatures, where you have color temperatures that are LED or halogen or sodium halide lights that are going to be extremely yellow or orange or even reddish in color, and some will look blue. And this scene here is actually of the capital city of Cambodia, Phnom Penh. And this is taken from one of the few high-rise buildings that is in that city, in the residential area. This is one of the sort of suburbs of the city where it's not a downtown. It's still a very urban environment though. And you can see within the photograph that there's a lot of mixed color. In this area it's kind of bluish green because of probably fluorescent bulbs. In this area it's very yellow because of sodium halide street lamps. This area has kind of a pinkish tone, and I'm not sure if that's because of different kinds of lighting effects, because it looks like there's an uplight. So maybe across the street there's a colored neon storefront. I'm not exactly sure. But you're going to see that there's a number of different colors, and that's actually one of the interesting things about shooting cityscapes. There's a lot going on. If you have a really good view with a lot of different lights and things like that, then you could actually come out with a really cool photo. You're not going to need to have as long of an exposure when shooting cityscapes because there's going to be so much light. So this shot is actually at 1/3 of a second with ISO 500, which is really not that long of a shutter or very high of an ISO. Notice though that there are no stars in the sky. Stars are a very low brightness. So if you want to be able to expose for a star, you're going to have a much longer shutter speed, which means that the city itself would just be completely overexposed. It's very difficult to balance those two. You may find areas where you're far enough from the city where you can balance those exposure. Now remember, the distance that you get from the light will reduce the luminosity. It's kind of like when you're walking with a flashlight at night. You can't shine it infinitely far away. Once you get closer, then those things become brighter. The longer it has to go and come back, the less luminosity there's going to be, because it's going to get absorbed by the end object, it's going to get dispersed by the atmosphere. There's a lot of different reasons why those objects will appear darker. Other things that you have to contend with in cities is pollution. Not just air pollution, but light pollution. Remember, air pollution is particulate matter that's in the air. Light pollution, which is a kind of a bad sounding word, but all it means is that there is light being emitted in the area, bouncing off the atmosphere, obscuring our view because it's actually illuminating the air. When the air itself, the atmosphere, is getting brightened up, then we can't see beyond it, because beyond it is a much lower light transmission. So the stars are going to be so dim in comparison to the brightness of the sky itself, which is why we can't see stars during the day. Now, perspectives, your composition is going to vary depending on access. So if you do get access to a rooftop or a high rise or something like that, or maybe a walking path on a bridge, then you'll be able to get a really cool vantage point. So cityscapes is something that's going to require a little bit of effort, travel, and planning and forethought. So be on the lookout when you're out during the day, checking out for really interesting vantage points. I want to introduce you to a friend of mine, Malcolm Webb, who is a cityscape photographer in New York. And he has been shooting cities for a long time, and it's one of the things that he specializes in, and it's really sort of his area of interest. It's the thing that he started doing and really connected with. So his art form is going out into the city at night, finding high vantage points, and taking really cool photos. Now, one of the things about his collection of images is that he has a very strong look and feel in not just his composition, but the crispness, the sharpness, the light quality. And one of the things that he's really interested in is actually light trails. So in a lot of his images, you're going to see roads and streets where the lights leave trails. And that can be from headlights or taillights, sirens, things like that. Anything that generates a light that moves is going to create a trail. Now, same thing with stars. If you had a really long exposure, that's a little bit more complicated though. You would need like a 30-minute to 1 hour exposure or longer in order to get stars to make a trail. But we'll talk about that maybe in one of the more advanced modules for landscape. Getting light trails requires the camera to be locked down because you need to have sharpness in the non-moving objects, the city itself. You have to have a slow shutter, but not too slow. If the shutter speed is too slow, then the light actually will kind of fade out in comparison to the rest of the scene. So you have to balance your exposure to make it long enough in relation to the speed of the objects that you're photographing. So if you're on a city street where the cars are only moving 15 to 20 miles an hour, that's quite slow. So you're gonna have to have a little bit of a longer shutter, otherwise the trails will only make it maybe a quarter or halfway across the frame. If you want them to go all the way across the frame, before you even take an exposure, you can have a stopwatch or use the stopwatch app on your phone or something and check to see how long does it take on average for that car or vehicle to cross all the way across your frame. You can find that it would take as long as 8 seconds or longer, depending on if you're looking down at an oncoming object. If you have a frame where you're locked off looking across and the objects move perpendicular to your frame, they're going to be moving much faster in relation to that. If you are looking down a street, it could take 8 or 9 seconds for the vehicle to come from the point where you first see it to come all the way into and past your frame. Take an exposure, evaluate it, make adjustments, and then proceed. On this image that we're looking at here, it was shot with a Nikon D800 at 14 millimeters, which is quite wide. It was at an f5.6 and an exposure of 8 seconds. So if you need your shutter to be open longer in order to get those light trails to go the entire length of the frame, you're gonna have to either increase your aperture, your f-stop, by going up in numbers to make it smaller to allow less light in, or you can reduce your ISO, which is your sensitivity. Remember, as you open your shutter longer, you're allowing more light in. If that means that your image is going to be overexposed, you have to use one of the other two of the exposure triangle to reduce your overall exposure. And that would be your ISO, your sensitivity, or your f-stop. So I've already mentioned the effects of light pollution on a cityscape, but what about in terms of a shot where there's no city in view? There still could be light pollution. Now, on a long exposure, if you're within, say, 15 to 20 miles of a city, and even further if it's a really big city, like say New York, Manhattan, Chicago, San Francisco, these cities are so large that they're going to be affecting many miles around them, and that they're going to be creating an atmospheric glow that's going to bounce a great distance. So in order to get far enough away, you're going to have to travel quite a distance out into the wilderness, the woods, the mountains, or the desert in the southwestern United States in order to get far enough away. I've been as far away as 25 miles from a city and still seen a slight glow on the atmosphere. Sometimes that can be solved by just turning in the opposite direction. and then problem solved. But the effects could actually be in your benefit in an interesting way. This photo I took on the beach in the Philippines on an island. Now it actually still was picking up some very distant lights from other neighboring islands. I don't know how many miles away I was, or kilometers, since that part of the world doesn't use miles, but I can tell you for sure that there was some atmospheric effects going on. You can see that there's some very light misty clouds low on the horizon, and they have kind of a yellowish red tone, and that's because of the bouncing light in the atmosphere being picked up from other islands. That light could be picked up from my right or my left. It seems unlikely that any of these islands out here are bright enough to create that effect, but it's still very possible. It could have been something that's just obscured from my view. There could be a light and then a building in front of it. That light is going over the top of the building. I can't see it directly, but it's still going to be impacting the horizon in front of me. When there's no clouds to pick up that visible effect, all it's going to do is brighten the atmosphere. So it's going to make it look like it's almost before dawn or just after sunset, when it's still too bright to see the stars. Here's a great example of a city in the distance. This shot is actually taken again in Moab, in Arches National Park, and I'm just facing about 90 degrees to the left of that first canyon wall that I showed you. Now over in the distance is actually a town. It's a really small town of Moab, but it's creating enough light where it's creating a pretty strong glow just over the horizon there. So you can see the dramatic effects that light pollution can have. Now to my naked eye, I could barely see this, even after being outside for half an hour, in the complete darkness with no artificial lights. However, the stars were visible to my eye. Only the brightest ones though. I wasn't able to see this number of stars. There's quite a lot here. You can even see in the distance the mountain peaks covered in snow. That is just so incredible. And I didn't know that they were there. That's the really cool thing about night photography, is that sometimes you see things that you have no idea are even visible. And these peaks over here are illuminated only by the glow of that town nearby. Now that's pretty cool. Artificial lights can add to your shot, as I kind of feel they do here, or they can really ruin your shot by being visible in the distance and just kind of blowing out the shot. You can think of experimenting with something like a flashlight, where if if there's trees or architecture within the scene, you can try lightly painting light on top of that scene in order to build up the exposure. Now you're going to find that your camera is very sensitive when you have a 20-something second exposure, so you probably only need a really fast flicker of that flashlight just to illuminate enough to be able to see it. Now, if you do it from behind your camera, things are going to look a little front lit. So try getting a little further from the camera and adding another angle of the light so that it can add to the photograph. Here's my first Milky Way photo that I've ever taken. Capturing the Milky Way is a big challenge, because not only does it require knowing the time of year that it's going to be visible, at what time of day. Sometimes it's going to be visible during the daytime, which is impossible to photograph it. Other times it'll be visible around 4:30 in the morning, not ideal, but if you're really interested in capturing it, it'll definitely be worth setting an alarm, getting up 20 minutes before you plan to shoot, and then going, and especially if you're camping or if you have a cabin in an area with total darkness. Now this is something where you're going to need an app like SkyGuide to be able to predict where it's going to be at what time. So you're not going to just be out there guessing, because if you set it for the middle of the night, you actually could have missed it. Sometimes the Milky Way is visible early in the evening, other times it's visible later in the evening. Sometimes it's more convenient and it's around 11:30 p.m. And that's kind of ideal because you don't have to stay up too late, and you don't have to get up super early to capture it. It will depend on weather and the moon phase. If you have a new moon, which means that there is no moon visible in the sky, that's going to be perfect because you're going to have total darkness. If you have a full moon, forget it. The moon is going to look like the sun. It's going to look like daytime when you take that 30-second exposure. If you have a really cloudy sky, it's going to really obstruct and obscure your view of the Milky Way, and that also is pretty bad. Now, the 2 times that I've been able to capture the Milky Way, I planned it more than a month in advance. I knew the direction I had to face and the time of day or night that I was going to have to be out there to shoot it. And I went to the location, which was going to be really dark, and pre-planned, and I got really good results. I did not have any clouds, and I'm going to show you the second result right here. This one is separated by about 2 years, so I grew a lot as a photographer during that time. And this one I shot in Santa Fe, New Mexico, whereas the one before that I shot in Moab, Utah. So both are in the southwest of the United States, far away from a city with a lot of environmental light to destroy the atmospheric view. I didn't have clouds on either one, and I had a new moon on both nights, which is just perfect. Now, you would be shocked at what the image looks like before I process it. The Milky Way does not look like that to the naked eye, not even close. That is actually the image that I processed that from. Doesn't look like there's much there. On my camera back, it was set to maximum brightness, so I was able to see that I had captured the detail that I needed. Now, I could have gotten a brighter exposure if I had slowed my shutter speed down, but I was starting to get a little bit of star movement, and I wanted to keep them a little bit crisper. Now, there's something called the 500 rule, which is 500 divided by your focal length, and that will tell you the maximum number of seconds that you can expose before you start to see motion in the stars. Now, that is kind of pushing it a little bit, because if you follow that rule exactly, which if I were to take this image and I shot it at 17 millimeters and I take 500 divided by 17, I end up with roughly 29. So I could have done a longer exposure, but you do get a little bit of motion in there. So I like to stay on the shorter side of that rule. So I did 20 seconds and I ended up with this exposure. Now, I knew that I had enough in there, and when I push it, and I raw processed the image, I ended up with this. Now, I put a lot of time into processing this image because it's my artwork, so I spent a lot of time going in and selecting out the colors that I wanted to really pop, and creating a selection around this diagonal portion of the frame, and enhancing the brightness so that you could really see the brighter parts of the galactic core. I also worked really hard at making sure that the black stayed black and that the noise profile of the image didn't become too extreme and distracting. So it's actually a pretty smooth image, and if you were to print it large, it doesn't have a lot of noise and pixelation in it. So beware, a lot of the images that you're going to produce this way are going to be higher ISO images, probably around 2000 or 2500 ISO, in order to set your exposure to something reasonable. You're going to need a lens that can open up to a wider aperture. You're going to need something that's at least a 3.5, wider if better. So if you can get an f2 or an f1.8, that's going to be ideal. The lens that I used here was only an f2.8, which meant that I had to have kind of a high ISO and a longish shutter speed. One thing that's really challenging is focusing on the stars, because your camera, if you're using a mirrorless, is not going to give you a whole lot to look at. It's going to be boosting the signal so much that when you zoom in, it's going to look out of focus even when it's in focus. So I always have to kind of play with it, play it back on my screen, make sure that I've gotten it, and then go and nail in my exposure. You will be shocked by how much data is held within your raw file. Raw files have a lot of information about the highlights, the color, and the shadows. Different software is going to give you different results though, so if you don't like the results of one raw processor, try another one and see if it is better. The raw processors not only have their own algorithms and programming designed to give you their results according to what that software can provide, they're also going to read the brands of the different cameras differently. And since I shot this one on Fuji, most of the raw processors don't handle it perfectly, which is why I like to use Capture One as my preferred method when using raw files from my Fuji. However, I have found that there are some really great results from other software. One of the software that I've been using recently is called Luminar by Skylum. And Luminar is a great balance between cost and efficiency and understandability, the simplicity of the layout, where Lightroom by Adobe and Capture One are both aimed at professionals A lot of amateurs use them, but they're very confusing to get started with. There's a lot of terminology that's unique to them. There's a lot of sliders that can be very overwhelming. And one of the things that I like about Skylum is that it actually starts you out with a simple layout designed for beginners, and then as you want to get more professional, you can click and open up more palettes so that you don't get overwhelmed at the start. It also has some really genius artificial intelligence built in to handle things like sharpening and color and brightness and darkness and contrast and all these different aspects of the photograph that's really required. So I'm going to jump into Luminar 4, which is just released now, and I'm going to show you a really quick adjustment to this image. Okay, so you can see my desktop here in Luminar 4, and right off the bat, you're going to see that this image looks very different than the one I just showed you in the presentation. Now that's because, again, they're processed by different software, so it's going to be reading the image in a different way. Now, one thing I want to tell you right off the bat is that night images are going to be challenging to process. You're going to see a lot of remnants of different things. So you may see a lot of pixelation. So if we zoom in on this image, you can see that there's some modeling that's going on here where the color, see how it has microscopic changes in color where it's kind of like a blue and then there's got like pinks and reds in there. And as cameras develop and get better, the high ISO performance is going to be dramatically improved. So that's one reason why we might want to upgrade. If we're interested in doing low light photography, especially, then we're going to want to have a camera that performs especially well in darkness. Now, I did not bring my Fuji in particular to shoot this photo. I had to shoot a number of different photographs. I was shooting landscapes during the day, and I knew that I did want to shoot this, but I didn't want to bring more than one camera. My Fuji X-T3 does perform really well in low light, but as I mentioned, the lens that I had only opened up to f2.8. So if I had another lens that was a wider aperture for a wide enough angle to capture this, then I would have been able to reduce my ISO. Now, so that is just one aspect of this image, and I'm not totally happy with it. It is a bit noisy. But when you're getting started, you're going to be really excited just to see that you captured this kind of dramatic scene. So let's undo the adjustment layers that I've done here, and you can see the path that I took to get there. So we start out with this, and let me actually trash these and get them out of the way so that you're not distracted. And get rid of these by doing that. Delete layer, select the down arrow, dot, 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 delete layer. Okay, so this is our untouched image. So you can see that there's actually something down here that I had removed. There was a little bit of a street lamp or something in a parking lot at a distance that was coming through the branches. So we're gonna have to get rid of that. But before we get to that, let's just work on the overall exposure. So you can see the essential palette right here. If we just click on the light here, this sun, that's just our light and darkness and color and our basic enhancements. There are other palette layouts here, so you can go to creative, but these are not really applicable. This is for portrait. They're not applicable to astrophotography. So if you go to Pro, you can see that there's a lot of advanced features within this program. So we're not even going to talk about these. We're just going to go right here to the basic essentials palette. Click on light, and then you can see that there's the basics. There's temperature, color temperature, tinting, exposure, smart contrast, highlights and shadows, so just light and dark. Let's just start by brightening it up. Let's just go right to around 2 stops or just underneath. We know that we're going to want to brighten up the highlights to make those stars really pop. And then we know we're going to want to drop the shadows to make sure that the blackness stays there. You can use the smart contrast, which is really intelligent at pulling out the details that we're going to want to see. Okay. Now, one of the things we want to change is the color temperature, because the auto white balance feature at night really doesn't have a lot to go on, so it's kind of guessing. So we can cool it down a little bit, right to about there. It makes the sky look blue in the darkness there, and then the color temperature tint, you can see what happens if we slide it to green or we slide it to purple. So somewhere around there. Now it's still not looking bright enough. So let's pull up the whites, and then let's open the exposure a little further. It's pretty cool. Then the other palettes that are in here are also really interesting. If you go to the AI enhanced, I'll just turn them on and off so you can see what happens. You can see how that if you go all the way, look at what happens to the color. That's a little bit weird, right? And then you can see the fade at the bottom. That's not really ideal. So let's just use a little bit of that. And then structure, this is going to provide a sharpness, sort of a grit to the image. So if we pull that up, look what happens to the Milky Way itself. It actually pulls out the micro definition between the light and the dark. However, it's a little bit too dramatic, so you don't want so much of it. You want to be able to slide it up and then back it off to the point where it starts to look normal. Then boost is just going to take that effect and amplify it. And in the color, we have our saturation, which is going to enhance that effect. Now, if you go too far beyond what the data really provides, then you're going to start to end up with tons of that modeling of the color. So if we go too far, see what it does, how it brings out the blue and separates it from the red. And that is because the color sensor of the camera is made up of red, green, and blue pixels. So everything in the variance is going to be reddish, greenish, or blue. So now let's take a look at the denoise feature. Let's go back to the core here where you can see most of the detail. Now when I move it around, it's going to go to a low res like that, and then when I let go of the mouse cursor, it takes a second to process and it brings back all that detail. You can see it has a real gritty appearance to it, and that is all that noise that's brought out from the high ISO. If I click up here in the info palette, I can actually see I was at ISO 2000, f2.8, 20 seconds at 17 millimeters. Back to edit, go down to denoise. Now there's going to be a couple of options in here. If you click on advanced settings, you can see that there's a boost function here. So if you were to turn up these sliders, they could then be independently affected by the boost. And I think that if it's at zero, it doesn't do anything. Well, it's going to be very, very light. Yeah, it doesn't do anything. And if I turn up the boost, this is sort of like how much of the effect I want it to be. I think the standard is 25. So turning it all the way up to 100, and then the boost is only at 25. I can now increase the effect 3 times more to 50, 75, and 100. So you can see, give it a second to process, it's actually really smoothed out the noise. Now the color denoise is not going to have a dramatic effect in this image, and I think that's because of how little there is to go on. It's not really something that we see in reality. This image has become supernatural, right? So the color denoise is going to be a little bit confused. But in theory, what it's supposed to do is take the splotches of the red, green, and blue, which is what the sensor of the camera is made up of, red, green, and blue pixels, and it is going to be exposing them and then averaging out the areas. Now, when you have these underexposed areas, and then you boost the exposure by 2 stops, it's going to create this kind of a weird noise pattern. The color denoise is going to do its best to smooth that out and bring back the fine details of those faded stars, but it's not going to do a great job. So let's just pull this all the way up just to see what happens. We give it a second to process. It kind of looks the same. It doesn't really done a whole lot. You're going to have a better effect with the color denoise in a better exposed image with something like skin or other details that are much larger. We're dealing with something that's got this really fine detail in here. There's basically just stars and then infinite blackness with color fades. So there's not going to be a whole lot for it to reference. Let's go to the layers palette right here. You can see we have 1 layer, right? If we go over to this palette, which is our canvas, then you can see things like clone stamp. So we'll click that. Okay, and then we can zoom in down here. You are going to set where you want to see, as you see the dialog here, click to set the source, which is this dark area here. And then if I right click, I can reduce my size and then I just start painting like this, just by clicking and dragging it around, and it's gone. So we go up to done. It's going to process and then bring us back to our normal layout. We'll go back over to our layers palette, and you can see that the clone and stamp now has its own layer, which if we turn off, then that little light over there comes right back. So this is definitely the easiest way that I found to be able to clone stamp things out of your images. And if you're interested in checking out Luminar 4, check below the video and get a special coupon code and link from PhotoIQ to get you $10 off your purchase. Night photography is going to require a lot of experimentation, no questions. The results are extremely unpredictable. When you see a scene during the day, you're not going to know which lights are going to be visible during the night. And this was shot from the shore of Kauai in Hawaii. And I knew that this log was here and that I wanted to get a shot of it with the waves coming in and the water in motion with a long exposure. But I didn't know that there was going to be all this stuff on the opposite shore. It kind of looks like there's nightclubs or something. And this is pretty late at night, around midnight, and there's a lot of lights. And not only are there a lot of lights, they're really bright. They're so bright that you see this sort of magenta and orange and blue and green hue rising up very far from the shoreline, visible on the clouds all the way up to here. So because I had these clouds here, which I could barely see with my naked eye, they were picking up all the lights from the opposite shore, which in reality is probably about a mile away. That's the dramatic effect that artificial lights are going to have on your scene. Now there is a little bit of other light in the scene, but it's actually from behind me where there were some security lights in the distance, and those are actually helping to illuminate this side of the log, which makes it pretty cool. I don't love this photo, but it is pretty interesting. It's got some cool stuff going on. Now, if I turned around, this is the scene that I got. The other interesting thing going on here is that there's other security lights down the beach, and they're creating this really interesting streak on the horizon of the water. It's illuminating the waves as they're just lightly cresting towards the beach. But you can make out a lot more stars versus if I back up and I go to this scene where you can see only the brightest stars. Literally all I did was turn around. I just turned to the left 90 degrees and I got this photograph. There's still some of these wispy clouds on there, and there's some very interesting highlighting going on of the water. It almost looks like a pool at night that has lights inside the pool. Okay, we've come to your assignment. Your assignment this week for landscape is to shoot 2 images in low light. The composition and the situation are up to you. Make sure that you do some planning beforehand so that you bring adequate support for your camera, tripod, or something like it. Be familiar with how to turn on your self-timer. Be prepared to experiment a little bit to get your composition the way you want. Also, make sure that you know how to shoot a long exposure. Some cameras may seem to have a limit on what you can turn the exposure dial to, but there's always a way to expand it longer. So if your dial, say, only goes up to 10 or 15 or 20 seconds, usually you can use one of the command dials to expand that and make it longer. Make sure that you dress properly. If it's going to be cold, you want to make sure that you have jacket and gloves. You don't want to be out there freezing. Okay, I hope you enjoyed this lesson, and I hope to see you next time. Until then, keep shooting.